What I'm going to be talking about today is the novel psychoactive substance universe. I'm going to be talking about the market a little bit, and then going into some of the novel psychoactive substances of note that I believe are very, very problematic and may cause damage or reduce the inertia of the psychedelic research renaissance that so many other talented individuals are speaking about here this weekend. And this is a picture of MDPV, which is one of the more notorious bath salts that has shown up in the legal high market in the United States and the Western Europe. Not exactly a fun drug, but definitely one that was popular a couple of years back. Just to give you a sense of the novel psychoactive substance market, a lot of them are taken under the umbrella of amphetamine-type stimulants like synthetic cathinones and others. That market is almost 500 tons of substance produced annually, costs about $63 billion. Well, that's the size of the market. And there are about 56 million consumers of these drugs, which recently just passed the worldwide totals of the heroin and cocaine markets actually combined. But what exactly does this substance, what does this mean? So I'm just going to take the European Monitoring Center for Drugs and Drug Addictions definition of novel psychoactive substance so that we can keep that in our mind. Basically, a new narcotic or psychotropic drug that in its pure form or preparation that is not yet controlled by United Nations drug conventions, but that may pose a public health threat comparable to those substances that are already listed. Basically something new that hasn't been scheduled, that hasn't been focused on by either law enforcement or public health organizations. And just since, to kind of put these things in context, literally the weekend before I planned on coming out here, a music festival in Florida in the United States had a bad batch of one of these novel psychoactive substances that are as yet undetermined of an identity that resulted in the death of 2 and the hospitalization of 57. That is a substance that we still have no idea what it is, and it was flagged as some type of Molly or amphetamine type stimulant. This is the standard, ladies and gentlemen. People don't know what the stuff is, but the news is going to flag it as something such as MDMA or a psychedelic because they don't know, and until they don't know, whatever kind of previous and pre-existing bias that exists about drugs is going to be slapped onto it. And to give you a sense of the scope of the problem, this is from the EMCDDA last year. That's the number of novel substances that have been picked up by the organization just in Europe alone. And I do want to emphasize that the bottom half, that's 60 new substances, the red and green bars, that's entirely taken up by those amphetamine-type stimulants that have potentially psychedelic effects, or synthetic cannabis like K2 and Spice, those fake pots that have been showing up all over. And these substances are not just different brands. These are unique chemicals that are being synthesized and sold in gray markets all over the world. This is a chemical structure comparison between some of the more classic substances like THC and amphetamine and the other drugs that are now showing up, such as UR144 and MDPV, like you saw earlier. This is some data from the National Health Services report from Scotland, basically talking about drugs and drug effects every year. And I don't really know how to make this any more stark. I am not familiar with etizolaam, which is designer benzodiazepines. I am not familiar with ethylphenidate, which is a chemical iteration on Ritalin. But these are substances that did not exist on the radar of medical practitioners in 2012 and are now killing more people than all classic psychedelics and MDMA combined. This is a study from a music festival out in the United States. Basically, an organization stood outside of the booth and told people, hey, listen, we'll give you 20 bucks if you tell us what you took, what you're planning on taking, and if you give us a blood or urine sample so we can confirm. And a lot of people had a very specific understanding of what they were taking. They, largely believed they were taking marijuana, alcohol, cocaine, and MDMA. But out of the 104 participants, even though 30% had said they were taking MDMA, many, many individuals who had said they were taking it also tested positive for a bath salt called alpha-PVP. Additionally, they were also testing positive for methylone, ethylone, or butylone, which are 3 amphetamine-type stimulants that are considered novel psychedelics, novel psychoactive substances. And this means that straight up, many, many individuals that are consuming these drugs are not consuming them on purpose. They're purchasing something underground from either a dealer or a friend, and they are literally getting something completely different. This is a very, very different situation than when you would purchase LSD and you would get a piece of paper. There's a very big difference between getting simply nothing and getting a totally different substance that approximates the effects you were looking for. This is some research that's actually still in press by Dr. Joseph Palomar at NYU, and I would like to kind of emphasize the findings, so I'm just going to read the table results. Racial minorities were more likely to report no lifetime bath salt use, but have a positive hair sample for bath salts. And additionally, those who reported no use of bath salts, but tested positive for an NPS, were more likely to report having earned less than a bachelor's degree. This starts to paint a very, very disturbing picture of the idea that the individuals that are not getting the psychedelic that they want are generally lower income, maybe less educated, maybe a minority individual. And that is a trend that is deeply concerning for me. The idea that your class, your race, your ethnicity, or your education would in fact determine whether you are able to have the psychedelic experience of your choosing. I think that is something that is only now developing as a problem, and we need to start taking it seriously because it affects not only our the perception of psychedelics, but the actual experience that people en masse are having. This is a study from 2013 published in Drug Testing and Analysis that showed just, look for the data for yourself. I know that some of us may be familiar with 2CI and 2CE, but I do not recommend consuming 25I PMMA or 4-FMA unless you have very, very specific understandings of what these drugs are. And these are total notifications by member states to the monitoring organizations so that these are the number of times these drugs managed to hit an ER that were totally novel and the systems didn't know how to handle them. And when I do mean there are a lot of drugs, I mean there are a lot of new drugs. I'm not familiar with most of these. I don't think anyone in this building is actually familiar with most of these, and that is hugely worrying because if all of a sudden you have a forensic psychologist, I had an NYPD forensic examiner call me and ask me about one of these sedatives. I have no idea. I mean, these drugs didn't exist 2 to 3 years ago, and now they're starting to show up in autopsy reports. My biggest concern is that one of these is going to be deeply problematic. Speaking about those synthetic cannabinoids, just in the United States, the stars mean that they're Schedule 1, and the other drugs are not. When you buy K2 or Spice, they don't tell you what the active ingredient is. They don't tell you which one of these chemicals you're actually getting. So one brand may be 100% legal for human, for having not been scheduled yet, and the other one could be a Class 1 felony. So just because of how crazy this is, I wanted to take Professor David Nutt's words directly. One of the dangers of this approach is that has been taken, if we ban every new drug without a balanced view, then people will keep making more new drugs to replace them, and eventually they will make something that's extremely toxic, which, when the kids take it, they will die. That, I don't want to be a fearmonger. I don't want to try and be aggressive about this, but I think that the amount of new substances that have hit the market in the last 5 years that mimic classic psychedelics or have similar symptoms is tremendously problematic. And even though we may not interact with them on a day-to-day basis, some people are. So some of the more problematic ones that we have evidence for, firstly, 25I. I don't know if anyone in the room is aware of this substance, but it's something that can be used safely. There are definitely people that I know that have preferences for it under certain environments, under certain conditions. But it also has been associated with 17 deaths in the United States in the last 6 years. We have had individuals be medically transported from festivals because they've had seizures at half an hour after dosing. You know, one of the biggest problems with it is that it's active at a microgram level, just like LSD. But because of the fact that most people are usually only getting it from either street dealers or festival dealers, they're not getting exact dosages. You know, the biggest problem with that is that LSD is a relatively harmless substance. You may not have the best day if you take 5 tabs accidentally, but you'll be fine. You know, you'll wake up the next day. This is not the case with NBOMe. There are reports of seizures happening, cardiovascular events, agitation and aggressive behavior, and renal failure. You know, this is being scheduled. It's Schedule 1 in the United States. It's going to be scheduled in Canada as well. And it's definitely not something I'd like to be caught with in the European Union. One substance that got very, very big and then was quashed, thankfully, is a second-generation bath salt, commonly known as Alpha-PVP. The street names for it include Flocka and Gravel, just in case you wanted to get a sense of how awesome this substance is. This is, I think, a pretty stark illustration of the problem, where this is just the number of crime lab reports submitted between MDMA and synthetic cathinones. This basically means that around 2011, MDMA purity essentially evaporated in the United States, and synthetic cathinones rushed in to fill the void. Basically, in 16 months, you had 63 deaths in one city, in one state alone. That's not including all 50 states, because those numbers are still kind of hard to generate. But when you're getting 20 ER visits a day from a substance that didn't exist 5 years beforehand, there's kind of a huge pressure on law enforcement, public health, and governmental authorities to do something. One of the biggest steps forward they were able to make was they were able to push and pressure China to stop manufacturing the substance. So with that, combined with an extensive law enforcement effort across the United States, cases of alpha-PVP intoxication dropped to almost nothing, which, in my opinion, is a very, very good thing. It shows that targeted interventions for a lot of these substances can actually work. However, that also means we have to see them and we have to do something about it. You know, just to give you a scope of the problem, again, that's the number of different brands that were found in just Gainesville, Florida, of synthetic cannabinoids and synthetic cathinones. And the list of side effects that go from anywhere from self-mutilation, tachycardia, transient ischemic attacks, nausea, and serotonin syndrome, these are drugs that have risk profiles and side effects that classical hallucinogens and psychedelics have never had. And because of that fact, I think they're deeply problematic for the continued push to mainstream and normalize actually non-harmful psychedelics. You know, just to give you a little bit more information about synthetic cannabinoids, they're actually, the proper term is synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, because they're not actually cannabinoids. They're chemicals that were used to explore the cannabinoid receptor system. And there are 3 classes of them, but at the same time, they are all full agonists of CB1 and CB2, even though THC and CBD aren't. You know, these aren't drugs that were created to get high from. These were drugs created to explore the animal model of the cannabinoid receptor system. You know, the biggest problem is they have no quality assurance or quality control policies when these are being created. So not only do you have cross-contamination between brands of these synthetic cannabinoids, you have what are known as hotspots. Hotspots are basically what happens when someone's making drugs in their basement, where you take a pile of plant matter and you spray the synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonist on it, but the coverage is uneven. So that means you have differential quality and purity within the same bag of drug, which is insane if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. But there's nothing to be done about this because they exist in this gray market universe where if you stay one step ahead of a regulator, you can buy this stuff at a gas station. You know, there's this writer that I know, he has this blog called The Dose Makes the Poison, where he talks about different substances and their problematic, their problematic issues from a toxicology perspective. And I think he said it the best. You know, the vast majority of people using these substances and products are consuming substances of unknown identity with unknown pharmacological and toxicological profiles and unknown combinations, unknown dosages. This is probably the craziest thing that I've ever heard. Like the fact that it's not just a hallucinated fantasy, but the reality of thousands, if not tens of thousands of drug users all across the world is deeply kind of troubling to me. I'm going to talk very quickly about 2 substances that have been showing up in other drugs such as fentanyl. Basically, U18 is a novel opioid, or is considered a novel opioid, that has started showing up in benzodiazepines and designer benzodiazepine mixtures. And it's an opioid that has no activity at any of the opioid receptors, even though it's seen as approximately 10,000 times as powerful as heroin. We have no evidence of opioid receptor activity, but it's being considered an opioid. This is madness. You know, the narrative is completely different than what's actually going on in the science. You know, in the United States and Canada, we have additional problems when it comes to high-potency, high-strength opioids infecting non-opioid medications, where you have, because I can tell you right now, I can't tell the difference between those 2 benzodiazepines. One of them's actually made of an opioid that could probably kill you. The other one's Xanax. I mean, Xanax is not a great drug, but at the same time, it's certainly not lethal. You know, that's the problem, because once you combine something, a painkiller like fentanyl, and a novel sedative, such as one of these, you know, that giant stack that I showed you earlier, you end up with people in a very, very dangerous place. So now I want to talk about kind of why it's different this time around. You know, this is how we report those issues. You know, we don't really say what the drug is. We just slap the term rave onto the party and Molly onto the drug. And we say this person was hospitalized because they overdosed on Molly. Just as a show of hands, or, you know, call out. What color is Molly? Okay, does the fact that I heard 5 different answers bother anyone else? Like, if your daily painkiller was 3 different colors, would you take it? You know, obviously that's kind of a push out, but at the same time, ecstasy and Molly are a very, very loaded term. LSD means LSD. Psilocybin means psilocybin. But now we have these catch-all phrases that include almost anything. If I take Molly that has MDA in it, it's going to be a little bit more psychedelic. If I take Molly that has MDMA and a stimulant in it, I'm going to be running around for 3 hours. But at the end of the night, I'm still going to have the term Molly associated with an array of behavioral symptoms in my head. So when we talk about it, we're going to have 2 completely different definitions, but we're not going to confirm that. I'm not going to go, hey, was your Molly speedy? Like, I'm just going to think that it is, because that's what my experience was. And more importantly, NPSs, most of them, can't be detected by drug tests yet. I mean, this is one of the reasons why people do them. You work in security, you have a parole officer, you have all of these kind of concerns, and you can't be caught with a drug test. You can't be testing positive for cannabis or cocaine or anything. So you have one of these other options, which you maybe won't get arrested, but you might die. And also, like, specific details, and this is where I think it affects the psychedelic research renaissance, can slip through the cracks. There was this very famous story a couple of years back of this bath salts causing this person to, like, eat this other person's face, and it was terrifying. Except there were no bath salts in his system. There wasn't even any cannabis in his system. He was just mentally ill. But the story was run and pushed past and got super famous in the same way that every time there's a Molly overdose, what the drug actually is kind of completely ancillary to the story chasing. There was a case in a university in the northeast of the United States where somebody had taken a bunch of what seemed to be MDMA, but it was actually a synthetic cannabinoid. And that's a psychedelic, but at the same time, the story had already kind of come and gone, and a certain drug had been demonized. And that's where we are now. The Psychoactive Substances Act in the UK passed recently, and now we have this forensic strategy where we're going to be illegalizing drugs based on the receptor that it acts on, which, one, it only acts, the law only stated that receptor activity at CB1, GABA, 5-HT2A, NMDA, mu opioid, or a monoamine transporter would be